This narrative is a character string generated by an AI, a large language model statistically arranging words, and its truthfulness has not been verified.
Such outputs without basis are called hallucinations. While confabulation more accurately reflects reality than hallucination, we follow convention.
Therefore, the content described has no relation whatsoever to any real persons, organizations, nations, or events.
Shadow Deterrence, the Middle East Nuclear Chain. Prologue, the Chain of Assassinations. On February 28, 2026, in an underground shelter in Tehran, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was offering his final prayers. The moment Claude AI's precision analysis pinpointed his location and an Israeli military missile blew his head off, the supreme leader of Iran was gone. The IRGC commanders who served as his close aides were also wiped out in one fell swoop. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared victory, stating, "Iran's nuclear threat is over." However, this was only the beginning. Iran swore revenge and rained down missiles on the Gulf states. Smoke rose from the Jebel Ali port in the UAE, and fires broke out near the desalination facilities. The Gulf countries hosting U.S. military bases began to pay the price for keeping a bouncer, America, much like Yakuza Bars paying protection money. Chapter 1, The Logic of Attrition. In a basement in Washington, President Trump was holding a meeting with his staff. "Will our weapons inventory last 4 weeks?" Trump asked. The chief of staff shook his head, saying, "We have already depleted 800 Patriots, and hundreds of Tomahawks as well. Diverting our share to Israel will empty the U.S. military stockpiles." The morale of American soldiers was beginning to collapse. The question, "Why die for Israel?" spread, and protests from families flooded in. Trump's "America First" was becoming an empty promise. Meanwhile, in a war room in Tel Aviv, Netanyahu glared at a map. The Jericho 3's range covers all of Iran, but it cannot reach mainland China, he noted. The pace of the war of attrition was fast. The inventory of Arrow missiles was decreasing, and proxy attacks from the Iranian side began to reach the mainland. If U.S. support shrinks, an existential crisis will become a reality. In a strategic conference room in Beijing, a Chinese diplomat pointed to an oil chart. "Iranian crude oil is our lifeline. If Israel uses nuclear weapons, the supply will stop, and our economy will collapse." The coordination between China and Russia was deepening. Russia supplied S-400s to Iran, and China shared hypersonic technology. Iran continued its war of endurance, threatening the Gulf states as bars paying protection money. Chapter 2, The Collapse of Trust. The moment Iran's interim leadership heard the news of the assassination, they swore revenge. As long as Netanyahu is alive, there can be no reconciliation. When a syndicate's boss and underboss are killed, the retaliation cannot simply end with low-ranking members. The window for diplomacy was closed, and verbal promises were meaningless. Iran began attacking Gulf desalination facilities, making them look like collateral damage. The UAE's water supply was on the brink of crisis, and the bouncer effect of the U.S. military bases backfired. Netanyahu was losing support domestically. "Is there a successor?" an aide asked. "No. My path will collapse without me," he replied. The decline in U.S. military morale accelerated. Voices saying, "There is no need to fight for Israel," spread, and Trump suffered from domestic pressure. Chapter 3, The Logic of Nukes. The war of attrition exceeded 4 weeks. Israel reached the limit of its conventional weapons, and damage to its mainland increased. The Samson option crossed Netanyahu's mind: if we cannot defend ourselves with conventional weapons, we will settle it with nukes. However, China's reaction was the key, as China could not afford to lose its lifeline of Iranian oil. "A nuclear attack on Iran will be considered a nuclear attack on our country." This declaration came from Beijing. China's DF-41 ICBMs had Israel within their range, while Israel lacked the capability to attack mainland China. This declaration functioned as deterrence. Israel was forced to recalculate the cost of using nuclear weapons and raise its threshold. Although Russia was an energy-independent bystander, Israel's use of nuclear weapons carried the risk of emboldening hardliners in Ukraine. The Sino-Russian alliance used Iran as a shield, wearing down the US and Israel. Epilogue, the Shadow of Deterrence. The war headed toward a ceasefire. China's declaration was the only break that prevented a Middle Eastern nuclear war. However, this is merely a thought experiment. In reality, the chain of collapsing trust will not stop. It will not settle down unless Netanyahu disappears. Official announcements are meaningless, only logic speaks the truth. This novel is the crystallization of our discussions. If it feels like an unexpected event, it is proof that you have not yet reached the end of logic. The end.
All right, today we are diving into a pretty intense thought experiment. It's a fictional scenario for sure, but the logic behind it is, well, it's genuinely chilling. We're going to trace how a single strike in the Middle East could logically spiral into a full-blown global nuclear crisis. Let's get into it.
So, picture this. It's the near future, and this is the big headline. After a successful Israeli strike, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu makes this declaration of victory. Iran's nuclear threat is over. Sounds like a victory lap, right? The end of the story? But as we're about to see, that statement, that supposed endpoint, is actually just the first domino to fall.
So how does a fire like this even start? Well, it's not some massive invasion. It's something much quicker, much more precise. It all kicks off with a single, decapitating strike, an assassination, that's supposed to end a threat. But instead, it just lights a very, very long fuse. Okay, so here's how it plays out, and it happens fast. February 28th, 2026. Boom. An Israeli missile hits a bunker in Tehran. Iran's supreme leader and his top commanders gone. Just 6 hours later, Israel is declaring a decisive victory. But then, just 24 hours after the initial strike, Iran hits back. And here's the twist. They don't target Israel. No. They launch a whole barrage of missiles at the UAE and other Gulf nations, specifically hitting the ones with U.S. military bases on their soil.
Now that move might seem strange at first, but there's a cold, hard logic to it. The source material explains this with a great analogy, the Yakuza Bar. Think of it like this. The Gulf states are bar owners, and they're paying a really powerful gang, the United States, for protection. So what happens when an ally of that gang, in this case Israel, takes out a rival boss? Well, who's the easiest target for retaliation? Not the big gang itself, it's the bar. Suddenly, paying for protection made them the #1 target. So that initial shock and awe, it fades. And what's left is this new, grinding reality. This isn't a quick, clean fight anymore. It's turned into a long, brutal slugfest, a war of attrition. It's no longer about who has the better weapons, but who can last the longest.
And you can see two totally different playbooks here. On one side, you've got the US and Israel. They're using these incredible high-tech missiles, but they're burning through them like crazy. And these things are expensive and take forever to build. Meanwhile, Iran is playing the long game. They're digging in for a war of attrition, getting resupplied by Russia and China, and using their proxies all over the region to just stretch Israel's defenses to the breaking point.
And I mean, just look at the numbers. It is staggering. In only the first 4 weeks of this hypothetical war, the US has already fired off 800 Patriot missiles, hundreds of Tomahawks. At this pace, their stockpiles are just going to evaporate. The simple math of manufacturing, it just doesn't work. You can't build them as fast as you're using them. And this isn't just a problem on a spreadsheet, right? This is a human problem, a psychological one. This question starts getting whispered, then spoken, among US troops. Why die for Israel? Morale just hits rock bottom. And back in the States, President Trump is facing furious families, all asking the same thing. That whole America First promise is starting to look pretty shaky.
So, as the war drags on, it moves beyond military strategy. We're now entering a whole new phase. A phase where trust is just gone completely. Any chance for diplomacy, any kind of off-ramp, it's vanished. And to get why the talking stops, you really have to see it from Iran's perspective. I mean, their supreme leader was just assassinated, so for them, any offer of a ceasefire isn't just a no-go, it's an insult.
Let's go back to that gang analogy from the source, because it really nails it. You can't settle the score for a murdered gang boss by taking out a low-level soldier. For Iran, this isn't over until the score is settled, right at the very top. And with no deals on the table, the gloves come off. All those unwritten rules of war, gone. Iran starts hitting critical civilian targets, like the desalination plants that provide fresh water in the Gulf, calling it all unfortunate collateral damage. The UAE's water supply is suddenly on the brink of collapse. That American base isn't protection anymore. It's a liability, a magnet for existential threats. And all the while, back in Israel, Netanyahu's own political support is starting to crack. The war has now raged for over a month. It's an absolute meat grinder. Israel's conventional weapons are depleted. The homeland is taking direct hits, everything is escalating, and you can feel it building to its terrifying final act, where the ultimate weapon enters the equation. To really get what's going through Netanyahu's head at this point, you have to understand the Samson Option. It's Israel's last resort nuclear doctrine. Basically, if the state's very existence is threatened by conventional forces and there are absolutely no other options left, it reserves the right to use nuclear weapons to survive. And with his back against the wall, this is the card he's getting ready to play. So Netanyahu believes he has the ultimate trump card. But in this entire complex geopolitical calculation, from that very first assassination to this very moment, what was the one critical piece on the board that Israel completely missed? This right here, a stunning, unambiguous declaration from Beijing that changes the entire game. China publicly states that a nuclear strike on Iran will be treated as a nuclear strike on China itself. Now, why would they do that? It's simple: oil. Iran's oil is a non-negotiable economic lifeline for Beijing. A nuclear-ravaged Iran means the collapse of China's energy supply and maybe its whole economy. They are simply not going to let that happen. And this slide lays out the brutal strategic reality. Israel's Jericho 3 missile, it can hit Iran, no problem. But it cannot reach mainland China. China's DF-41, on the other hand, can easily reach Israel. And just like that, it's checkmate. A whole new level of deterrence has just entered the game, completely freezing Israel's Samson Option. So, in the end, what stops the nuclear bombs from flying? It isn't a peace treaty or a ceasefire. It's this new, unexpected layer of deterrence, a shadow cast from thousands of miles away. So, what does this whole thought experiment teach us? Well, first, that local conflicts can go global with shocking speed. Second, that modern wars are a brutal test of your economy and your political will, not just your military tech. And third, that when trust collapses, those diplomatic off-ramps just vanish. But maybe the biggest lesson is that deterrence is never a simple two-player game. Unexpected actors, driven by their own vital interests, can fundamentally change the entire board. And that leaves us with one final provocative question from the source material. This whole scenario was just a thought experiment, just following a chain of logic. So if the conclusion, the idea that China could become the ultimate arbiter of a Middle East nuclear crisis, if that feels surprising, well, maybe it's a sign that we haven't fully considered all the logical consequences of the world we're living in today.
I want you to imagine a geopolitical chessboard where a single hyper-advanced assassination doesn't actually end the conflict.
Right.
Instead, it triggers this global domino effect that is so severe, it threatens to drag literally every single superpower into the fray.
Because you usually assume taking out the king wins the game.
Exactly. But in this scenario, taking out the king, it just flips the entire board over.
Yeah. And that is the core premise we're dissecting today. It's such a striking concept because it forces you to look past the immediate headlines, and you really have to examine the hidden, highly reactive architecture of global conflict.
And that is exactly our mission for today's deep dive. We are exploring this highly logical, frankly chilling thought experiment titled Shadow Deterrence, the Middle East nuclear chain.
It's a fascinating piece.
It really is. But before we jump into the mechanics of this, I want to make it absolutely clear to you listening, we are looking at this purely as an impartial exploration of the author's thought experiment.
Right. Totally neutral.
We are not endorsing any viewpoints. We're not taking political sides here.
No, not at all.
We're simply following the author's logic, step by step, just to see where this hypothetical chain reaction actually leads.
Because the real value of a scenario like this isn't in trying to, predict the future with perfect accuracy.
Right.
It's about stress testing the alliances and the geopolitical assumptions we all just take for granted right now.
So, to set the scene, the text places us on a very specific date, February 28th, 2026.
Not that far away.
No, very near future. And we are in an underground shelter in Tehran, where Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, is saying his final prayers.
And the source text grounds this in a very modern, almost terrifying reality.
It really does. It imagines intelligence agencies basically feeding vast amounts of open source data, logistics, social media breadcrumbs, all of it into a large language model like Claude AI.
Just feeding the machine.
Exactly. And by using that massive pattern recognition, they pinpoint his exact location. And the moment that data clicks into place, an Israeli missile strikes. It eliminates him, along with a whole cadre of top Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps commanders.
Which, I mean, in conventional military doctrine, this is viewed as the absolute pinnacle of tactical success.
The ultimate win.
Right, a definitive decapitation strike. You have theoretically removed the leadership structure of your primary adversary in one fell swoop.
So right after the strike, the scenario has Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stepping up to a podium.
Naturally.
And he declares total victory. He announces to the world that the Iranian nuclear threat is over. He treats it as a definitive end to the whole conflict.
And this is the crux of it in asymmetrical warfare. Cutting off the head usually just scatters the body.
Right, the Hydra effect.
Exactly. The author uses this moment of supposed triumph to pivot the entire narrative. The text argues, with pretty ruthless logic, honestly, that this strike is not an end all.
It's a false victory.
A completely false victory that serves as the spark for a massive, uncontrollable chain reaction.
So let's look at Iran's immediate reaction in the text. They don't surrender.
No.
They vow absolute revenge. But rather than marching an army across the desert, or even launching a direct conventional counterattack solely at Israel, they do something else.
They start raining missiles down on Gulf states.
Yes. The source specifically describes smoke billowing from the UAE's Jebel Ali port and these massive fires breaking out right next to vital desalination plants.
And we really need to analyze that target selection carefully because it is incredibly deliberate.
They aren't just lashing out blindly.
Not at all. They are specifically hitting the economic and life support infrastructure of nations that host United States military bases.
And this is where the text makes this brutal but honestly brilliant comparison. It compares these Gulf states to bars paying protection money to the Yakuza.
That analogy is so good.
It is, with the United States acting as the heavily armed bouncer.
The logic of that analogy perfectly illustrates the vulnerability of these proxy hosting arrangements. In this scenario, the U.S. is the muscle providing security for a fee.
And the Gulf states are the bars paying for that protection.
Right. If a rival syndicate wants to send a message or exact revenge, they don't necessarily walk up and shoot the heavily armed bouncer.
They just burn down the bar.
They burn down the bar.
So the presence of the U.S. bodyguard actually backfires.
Precisely. Instead of acting as a protective shield, the U.S. bases turn these host nations into massive, static bullseyes.
Wow.
The text points out a profound irony here. The protector's presence actively endangers the client.
And the text details exactly how insidious this strategy gets. Because Iran disguises its attacks on the UAE's desalination facilities as mere collateral damage.
Oh, right.
They claim, oh, we were aiming for a military target, but the region's water supply just happens to get crippled in the process.
Which exposes the extreme fragility of these modernized Gulf states. Because you can build a glittering, ultra-wealthy metropolis in the desert, but it remains an artificial environment.
It needs water.
It is entirely dependent on fragile technology to sustain life. If someone breaks the water machine, you aren't just facing an economic dip.
Right.
You are in a terminal existential crisis within a matter of days.
So if the region's infrastructure is crumbling, and the shield is actively drawing fire to the people paying for it, the immediate question is, how long can the U.S. afford to play the bodyguard?
And that brings us directly to the strategic reality of war of attrition. The narrative in the source text actually shifts from the Middle East to a bunker in Washington,
where President Trump is meeting with his staff.
Yes, and this is where the concept of a war of ledgers comes into play. It is no longer about sweeping tactical maneuvers.
It's just math.
It's simply about who runs out of advanced munitions first.
I was looking at the section detailing the fallout in Washington, and it paints a really grim picture. Just how fast does this scenario think the U.S. would burn through its stockpile?
Staggeringly fast. The scenario notes that the U.S. has already burned through 800 Patriot missiles.
800.
800. Alongside hundreds of Tomahawk cruise missiles. The staff is informing the president that merely keeping Israel supplied is causing the American stockpile to completely bottom out.
But wait, the U.S. military budget is astronomical. Are we really supposed to believe a few weeks of proxy fire empties the absolute bottom of the barrel for a global superpower?
It's a matter of production capacity versus consumption rate. You can have an unlimited budget, sure, but defense contractors cannot manufacture complex, highly advanced systems like Patriot missiles overnight.
Right, they aren't just stamping them out on an assembly line in a day.
They take months, sometimes years, to build.
Yeah.
When you fire off 800 of them in a matter of weeks to intercept cheap drones and proxy rockets, you aren't just draining a local warehouse, you are pulling from the global reserve.
Which means the entire global umbrella shrinks.
Exactly. Those Patriot missiles are supposed to deter aggression in Europe and the Pacific as well. When they're depleted in the Middle East, the United States' ability to project power anywhere else in the world is fundamentally compromised.
And the drain isn't just physical either. The text dives deeply into the domestic costs within the U.S. The psychological toll is massive.
Yeah, the domestic front gets very complicated.
The text describes troop morale absolutely collapsing.
Yeah.
American soldiers are openly asking, why die for Israel? Families are protesting in the streets back home.
Because the political pressure becomes immense. The scenario points out that a foreign policy platform like America First effectively becomes an empty promise in this situation.
How so?
A nation cannot put its own domestic interests first if it's entirely entangled in and being economically and militarily drained by a foreign conflict with no clear exit strategy.
Right, the voters start noticing.
The public sees the cost both in treasure and potentially in blood, and begins to violently reject the premise of the entanglement.
So the supposed protector is bleeding out from 1,000 small cuts. Meanwhile, the scenario shoots back to Tel Aviv, where the situation is arguably even worse.
Yeah, Netanyahu is in a very tight spot here.
He's standing over his war maps, dealing with a brutal geographical reality. Israel possesses Jericho 3 missiles. They're incredibly capable. They can reach anywhere in Iran. But, as Netanyahu notes in the text, they cannot reach mainland China.
We will get to why that specific detail is so critical in just a moment.
Right. Keep that in your back pocket. But before we look at China, consider Israel's immediate defensive posture in this war of attrition. Their defensive aero missiles are running dangerously low.
The shield is cracking.
And because of that depletion, Iranian proxy attacks are starting to slip through the net. They are hitting the Israeli mainland directly,
which pushes Israel past a mere tactical challenge and straight toward an existential crisis. U.S. support is shrinking due to empty stockpiles and domestic political protests.
and Israel is physically running out of interceptors.
Right. So how does the Iranian leadership view this unfolding chaos? The text takes us inside the interim leadership in Iran, the people who took over after the initial decapitation strike.
And they revert immediately to the syndicate logic we discussed earlier.
Exactly. The Iranian leadership looks at the board and concludes that their boss and their underbots were just assassinated.
Right.
When you take out the very top of a syndicate, minor revenge from low-level members is insufficient to restore the balance of power. You can't simply blow up a convoy and call the score settled.
The text explicitly states that as long as Netanyahu is alive, reconciliation is impossible. The diplomatic windows are entirely boarded up.
That is a critical point. In this scenario, the trust deficit is absolute. Verbal promises, back-channel negotiations, UN resolutions, they mean absolutely nothing.
Netanyahu is feeling that isolation even within his own walls. The scenario includes a really telling detail where an aide asks him if he has a successor in place.
And he doesn't.
He replies that he does not. His entire strategic path collapses without him. He is the linchpin, but he's rapidly losing domestic support because the mainland is taking direct hits.
Now, if we pull back and look at the broader global picture, the real strategic nightmare for the U.S. and Israel begins to materialize.
Because it's not just a regional conflict anymore.
Right. While they are bleeding resources, burning through billion-dollar missile inventories and domestic political capital, the other major geopolitical players are not just sitting idle.
The text details how China and Russia are actively deepening their cooperation in the background.
The source tells us that Russia steps in and supplies advanced S-400 anti-aircraft systems to Iran. Simultaneously, China begins sharing hypersonic missile technology with them.
Okay, so what does that actually mean for the battlefield? Why are S-400s and hypersonic missiles such a game changer in this specific scenario?
It fundamentally alters the balance of power. The S-400 is one of the most advanced air defense systems in the world.
Right.
By supplying these to Iran, Russia effectively helps them create an anti-access area denial zone. It severely complicates any further conventional airstrikes by Israel or the U.S.
And the hypersonics.
The hypersonic technology provided by China gives Iran offensive weapons that travel at speeds practically impossible for the already depleted Arrow and Patriot systems to intercept.
So Iran is getting massive, sophisticated upgrades, while the U.S. and Israel are literally running on fumes.
And notice what Russia and China are not doing.
What's that?
They are not sending their own ground troops. They are not firing their own weapons directly at U.S. or Israeli targets. The text makes it clear Russia and China are effectively using Iran as a heavily armed shield to drain their primary geopolitical rivals.
Wow, it's proxy warfare at its absolute peak. They just sit back and let the U.S. and Israel exhaust themselves against a newly sortified, technologically upgraded Iran.
Which forces the conflict to its absolute brink. According to this scenario, we hit the 4-week mark in this war of attrition.
Just 4 weeks.
Yeah. Israel has reached the absolute limit of its conventional weapons. The Arrow missiles are practically gone, the mainland is taking devastating hits, and the conventional military options have completely evaporated.
Driven to the edge of the cliff, the scenario dictates that Netanyahu begins to seriously consider the Samson option.
A nuclear option.
Yeah. Using nuclear weapons to wipe out the Iranian threat and settle the conflict once and for all, simply because all conventional means have failed. It's the ultimate break glass in case of emergency strategy.
But this raises a fascinating question. What actually deters a nation from using a nuclear weapon in this highly volatile, back-against-the-wall scenario?
You might assume it would be the threat of a U.S. veto.
Or global condemnation at the UN.
Or even fear of a counterstrike from a nuclear-armed ally of Iran.
But the text introduces a massive structural roadblock, and it doesn't come from Washington or Europe.
No, it comes directly from Beijing. And this is the crux of the shadow deterrence mentioned in the title.
Yes.
The text explains the underlying economic reality. Iranian oil is the absolute lifeblood of the Chinese economy.
And this deterrence has nothing to do with human rights, international law, or a formal military defense treaty.
Nothing at all.
It is purely about crude oil and supply chains. The text spells it out. If Israel uses nuclear weapons on Iran, the oil permanently stops flowing.
The wells burn.
The ports are irradiated, the tankers halt.
And if that oil stops, the Chinese manufacturing sector basically grinds to a halt, and their entire economy flat out collapses.
Therefore, China cannot allow this to happen under any circumstances. It is a literal existential threat to their nation, even though they are geographically thousands of miles away from the blast zone.
Right.
To prevent this, China issues a terrifyingly simple asymmetrical ultimatum.
The declaration from Beijing in the text is chilling. They announce a nuclear attack on Iran is considered a nuclear attack on our country.
Which completely upends traditional nuclear deterrence theory.
It really does.
During the Cold War, deterrence was symmetrical. You nuke my city, I nuke yours.
Mutually assured destruction.
Exactly. But here, China is extending its nuclear umbrella over a non-nuclear state, not out of ideological brotherhood, but purely to protect a vital supply chain node.
So let's bring back the geography of this strategic checkmate. We mentioned earlier that Netanyahu knew his Jericho 3 missiles could reach Iran.
But they fall short of mainland China.
Exactly. But China's missiles do not fall short. The text specifically cites China's DF-41 intercontinental ballistic missiles. These weapons have a massive range and comfortably have Israel in their crosshairs.
So it's not even a military standoff.
No.
It's a completely one-sided hostage situation. China can vaporize Tel Aviv, but Israel has absolutely zero capacity to strike back at Beijing.
The text explains that this brutal, undeniable asymmetry forces Israel to recalculate the cost of using the Samson option.
It effectively raises the threshold so high that it stops them in their tracks.
They are deterred not by the enemy they are actively fighting,
but by that enemy's biggest customer.
It is a masterful exploration of how modern globalized economies dictate military outcomes. But we should also touch on Russia's position in this text because it provides a really interesting contrast to China's purely economic motivation.
Yeah, the text notes that Russia is largely a bystander when it comes to the specific oil dynamic.
Right, because Russia is an energy self-sufficient nation.
They do not rely on Iranian oil the way China does.
So why do they care if the Samson option is used?
Because of the geopolitical precedent it sets. The scenario points out Russia's specific fear. If Israel successfully uses a nuclear weapon to solve a strategic, conventional stalemate, It breaks a taboo that has stood since 1945.
Ah,
Moscow fears that an Israeli nuclear strike could embolden hardliners in Ukraine to seek or use radical, unconventional means to break their own stalemate.
the psychological shockwaves of a broken nuclear taboo would hit Eastern Europe immediately.
Exactly.
So we have this incredible climax. The war of attrition has ground everyone down to the bone. Israel is reaching for the nuclear button, and China steps out of the shadows and slams a giant economic military boot down on the entire conflict.
Which leads us to the conclusion of the thought experiment. The conflict, entirely devoid of good military options, heads toward a forced ceasefire.
Not because of a brilliant peace treaty.
Or a sudden diplomatic breakthrough. No, it's because of pure cold leverage. China's ultimatum serves as the sole break preventing a Middle Eastern nuclear war.
And the author leaves you with a very stark warning as the text concludes. This entire scenario is a crystallization of pure logic.
Yeah.
The author stresses that official announcements like Netanyahu's initial declaration of victory back on day one mean absolutely nothing in the grand scheme of things.
Words and press conferences cannot stop the collapse of trust.
Right.
The text argues that the situation won't truly settle unless Netanyahu disappears from the political landscape entirely.
Because the Syndicate Logic demands a balancing of the scales before any real quiet can return.
The author notes that if any part of this scenario feels unexpected, it just means we haven't followed the logic of our current global structure to its absolute inevitable end.
We often stop thinking at the point of the explosion.
Rather than tracing the shockwave all the way around the world, it forces you to look at the thousands of Patriot missiles and advanced stealth jets and realize that ultimately they couldn't dictate the final outcome.
Which brings me to a final provocative thought for you to mull over as you go about your day. We've spent this entire deep dive looking at a scenario where traditional military superiority is essentially neutralized.
Right.
So if the ultimate deterrent in a regional conflict is no longer the military might of a traditional superpower like the United States, but rather the fragile economic supply chains of a distant power like China.
How does that hidden shadow deterrence fundamentally rewrite the rules of every other global alliance today?
Exactly. If supply chains are the new nuclear umbrellas, who is actually protecting who?
It completely redefines what it means to be a superpower. It means every major trade agreement and resource dependency is a potential military tripwire.
It is enough to make you completely rethink the map of the world. Well, that is all the time we have for today's deep dive. We hope this exploration of shadow deterrence give you some serious insights and a new lens to view global events.
It's definitely a lot to think about.
Remember to keep questioning the surface of the stories you hear. Look for the underlying logic and never stop learning. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.